Hello, I'm Rob Kingston, Content Manager at MoveWise, and I'm joined for today's webinar by Kirsty Burnham, who heads up our property team. Today's topic is property auctions, and the main question we want to address is when to sell a property at auction. But we will also be answering a lot of other questions about auctions. And before we start, I'll set the scene with a few statistics about property auctions. So last year, just over 17,000 residential properties were sold at auction across the whole of the UK, with a total value of just under £3.2 billion. Obviously, the property market has been a bit disrupted for the last couple of years by the pandemic, but if we take an average over the last 10 years, there are close to 20,000 residential sales at auction every year. And when you consider that there are roughly 1 million residential transactions each year across the entire market, that is quite a small number, roughly 1 in 50 properties. So selling at auction is very much the exception. And I think many people aren't too familiar with the auction process. So Kirsty, perhaps a good place to begin would be to explain how auctions work and how they're different from selling through an estate agent.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So there are two different kinds of property auction. The first is a classic type of auction that you will have seen if you've ever watched the programme Homes Under the Hammer. It's also known as a traditional auction or an unconditional auction. And in this type of auction, the bidding takes place in real time in an auction room. Although these days, many auctions also offer live links over the internet, so people can join remotely if they wish to do so. But in this type of auction, when you are bidding, it all happens on the day. And when the hammer falls, the winning bidder is committed to the purchase of that property. Contracts are exchanged there and then, and a buyer pays a significant deposit, usually 10%, very similar to a normal exchange of contracts. And then they have a limited period of time, usually 28 days, to complete their sale. There is another type of auction, which is newer. It's called a conditional auction, also often known as the modern method of auction. And these auctions take place purely online, and the bidding occurs over a longer period of time, so often a month. And very similar to an eBay auction, although they don't have a fixed endpoint, so you can't snipe at the last second. In this type of auction, if there are still bids coming in at the end of the scheduled end time, then the timer will be extended by a short period to allow people to keep bidding until you have a winning bidder who purchases the property. And the most important difference with conditional auctions really is that the winning bid is not legally binding. So the winning bidder pays a reservation fee in addition to the agreed price, and then they get the exclusive right to buy that property. But contracts are generally not exchanged immediately. They usually have about 28 days to exchange and then a further 28 days to complete the purchase.
Okay, so in a traditional auction, the buyer can't pull out once they've placed that winning bid.
Correct, they can't, or at least if they do, they'd be in breach of contract, and therefore it would be a very expensive process for them. They would forfeit the deposit to the seller, which at 10% of the asking price is likely to be a lot of money. But also the seller can also pursue them for any costs or losses they personally incurred due to that sale falling through.
Okay, and what about the conditional auction, the modern method?
Well, with the conditional auction, because contracts aren't exchanged immediately, the buyer or the seller can pull out without any legal repercussions. But if the buyer pulls out, they lose the reservation fee they've paid. Unlike the traditional deposit, that doesn't go to the seller, but it goes to the auction house who keeps it. Whereas if the seller pull out, then they will have to cover the cost of refunding the reservation fee directly to the buyer. So either way, the auction house gets to keep their fee, and there's definitely a financial incentive for both sides not to pull out.
Okay, and what happens if there aren't any bids, or if the bids don't reach the reserve price?
First of all, you wouldn't have to pay any commission if the property doesn't sell. So in a traditional auction, any lots that don't sell get relisted, generally by the auction house, usually on a dedicated section of their website. And buyers can make offers on them at any price level, which the seller may or may not choose to accept. Otherwise, the seller can always choose to wait and list the property in another auction. With the modern method of auction, the usual approach would simply be to start a new auction period, perhaps adjusting the guide price to attract more interest. In this instance, there may be additional fees to pay to relist the property, but that varies from one auction house to another.
Okay, thank you. So that covers the basics of how auctions work. And the next question would be, what are the pros and cons of selling at auction? And why do only about 2% of houses get sold this way?
The biggest plus point in favour of selling a property at auction, especially traditional auctions, is the speed and the certainty of sale. If you have a winning bid, then you know that the property's sold, you get 10% of the sale price there and then, and you know it's going to complete within a reasonable time. Whereas with a traditional estate agency sale, there can be long delays, even in agreeing an offer. And once an offer is agreed, you have the uncertainty of buyers who may end up pulling out of the sale at any point. If you look at the stats from the last 10 years, about 77% of homes that have come up in auction have sold, which is a pretty good chance of success when you consider that estate agents on average only tend to sell about half the homes on their books at any one time, although that figure is higher at the cheaper end of the market. Obviously, depends a lot on the state of the market. At the moment, we're seeing a shortage of stock and very high demand, so auctions are less attractive. But auctions are also an inherently transparent process, so there's a chance of competitive bidding driving your price up. On the flip side, if you sell at auction, you are significantly limiting your pool of potential buyers. So generally speaking, if you're looking to buy a house, you're most likely to scour the auction. Unlikely to scour auction websites. You're much more likely to look at property portals or pop into your local estate agent or look in their windows. People often view auctions with suspicion, simply because they don't know much about them. And unless they're a particular type of buyer, which usually means a cash buyer who's looking for a good investment, then the speed of the traditional auctions in particular means that generally there isn't time to get a mortgage arranged and complete the sale in the required time, which is why cash buyers tend to be the buyers that purchase in these particular auctions. So auctions are really only going to expose your property to quite a small proportion of the potential buyers out there, and that's probably going to limit the price you're likely to achieve. Another thing that people should really take into account is the cost. Auctioneers' fees are generally quite a bit higher than estate agents' fees. 2% would be a typical commission compared to less than 1.5% on average with an estate agent. And on top of that, there's also an entry fee, usually at least a few £100s, which you have to pay to put the property into auction, whether it sells or not. In the modern method of auction, the buyer pays the fees, and this is a reservation fee, which is typically, and there's also a reservation fee, which is typically 4 to 5% of the sales price. However, even though the buyer's paying, the bid they're likely to make is going to take the fee into account. So the actual price that goes to the seller is likely to be less by a similar amount to that fee.
Okay, so to go back to the question that forms the title of our session today, what are the situations where you should sell a property at auction rather than going down the traditional estate agent route?
Essentially, there would be two main reasons. Either the property wouldn't be suitable for selling through an estate agent, or the seller's circumstances mean an auction is more suitable than a traditional agent. So the most obvious thing that would make a property more suitable for auction is if it's unmortgageable. And in fact, when we spoke to an auctioneer about this, Scott Gray from Homes Under the Hammer, he summed up that the less mortgageable a property is, the more auctionable it is. Auctions attract cash buyers, so they're not likely to be affected by the fact they can't get a mortgage on a property purchase.
And what kind of thing would make a property unmortgageable?
There are a number of things that can make a property unmortgageable. It might be of non-standard construction, so not a typical building with stone or brick walls or a tiled or slate roof. It might be derelict or in serious disrepair, might have significant structural defects, or it might be classed as uninhabitable, which would generally mean there's no functioning kitchen or bathroom in the property. Other problems could be to do with the area, if it's in a serious flood risk area or somewhere that's prone to significant subsidence. And there might be problems that aren't physical. So an example would be a short lease on a property. You generally can't get a mortgage if a property has a lease of less than 70 years. And another would be if you had any legal problems, such as boundary disputes or some kind of issue with the legal title of the property.
Okay, so unmortgageable properties are one type. What else might be better to sell at auction?
Properties that require a huge amount of work often go to auction. This is a common thing with probate sales, for instance. It's a bit more of a grey area because the market's really active and there's lots of demand. Then you might have more buyers on the lookout for a project, so particularly at the moment. But if it's a case of fairly cosmetic work and the property is mortgageable, you'd probably still do better on the open market. But for very serious projects where, again, you might struggle to get a mortgage, it's the investors at auction that are more likely to bid on that type of property. Other types of property that tend to sell at auction include building plots, which might be part of a garden being sold off for building potential, or it might be where the plot rather than the house is the main selling point. So a developer may buy the plot and actually demolish the property in order to build a new one. There's also land more generally, so woodland, farmland, amenity land. And then you also get mixed use properties very often at auction. So property with some kind of income stream, for instance, a shop with a flat above it would often, you'd often see those in auction. And then finally, another reason people might choose to sell at auction is if it's really tricky to put a value on a property. So if there's nothing for an agent to compare it to, so that might be a really unique type of property like a lighthouse or a Victorian folly, something like that. In this case, though, if it's an attractive property and in good condition, I'd still say it's better to talk to as many local agents as possible initially, because they might not only have a good idea of value, they very possibly might have people registered on their books who would be interested in purchasing it.
Okay, so those are the types of property that might be suitable for auction. What about the type of situation that the seller might be in that would lead them to choose an auction?
Essentially, it's where the seller needs a quick sale. So it might be that their personal circumstances have changed or that they need income fast. They might be trying to avoid repossession, something like that. Or it could be somebody that's inherited a property. They don't want the hassle and headaches of selling it. Or even if there's a family dispute over inheritance and the various parties can't agree on the best way to sell it or the best agent to list with. So the answer might be to let the market decide via an auction process. I think it's important to remember, though, that in all these cases, it's where the seller really just wants a guaranteed and simple sale, and that's more important than actually obtaining the maximum price for the property.
Okay, and price is an interesting point, actually. It's one of the questions that we wanted to answer at MoveWise when we started looking at auctions in more detail. Actually, what is the price penalty for selling at auction? If you ask auctioneers or if you go to the auctioneers' websites, they all tell you, that you can get a great price if you sell at auction. But we wanted to actually look at some hard data to get a comparison. It's certainly not an exact science because, as you've just said, the nature of properties that sell at auction, often they are going to have some kind of problem with them, whether that's a physical problem or something hidden. So it's going to be difficult to separate out the effect of those problems on the value from the actual effect of the selling method. But what we did to try and minimize that was take a sample of properties that have sold at auction over the last few months that are relatively standard properties, so not these really unusual properties, but maybe flats in a larger block or houses on streets that have a lot of very similar kind of properties, terraces or semis. We compared the prices, those properties achieved at auction with the sold prices and estimated prices online of neighbouring properties on the same street or very close by. And we found that on average, the auction sales had a discount of about 19% on other sales on the open market. As I say, you can't necessarily put all of that effect down to auction, but it does give an indication that sales at auction are from buyers who are looking to pick up properties at a discount. And I think that's why our advice would be that unless your property fits into one of those categories that, that Kirsty just mentioned there, or if your own situation means that you need a very quick sale, then it probably doesn't make sense to use an auction, at least initially. And while we're on the subject of price, Kirsty, could you tell me how people would go about setting their price if they're selling at auction, and how that might differ from regular valuations?
Yeah, sure. So when you choose to sell at auction, the auction house will advise on the valuation. With a traditional auction, they'll generally come up with their own valuation, which might be a desktop valuation, or it might be one that's done in person by visiting the actual property. Whereas the modern method of auction, they will often be working with local estate agents to come up with the valuation. But in both cases, the approach is different from what a local agent would use for a sale on the open market. Your traditional estate agent who's going to market the property would look at target price they'd ideally like to achieve, and they'd expect that buyers would most likely come in with offers slightly below that. Whereas in auction, the valuation is looking at what sort of price is going to try and attract bids, and hoping that the bids will go above the asking price.
Okay, and could you quickly explain the guide price and the reserve price and the difference between those?
So the guide price is the figure that appears in the listing. So that gives bidders an idea of the expected value of the property. And the reserve price is decided between the auction house and the seller, and it's the minimum price that the seller will accept. The reserve price is kept secret, but by law, it mustn't be more than 10% higher or lower than the advertised guide price. So you can't lure buyers in with an unrealistic guide price.
Okay, so when you're selling at auction, especially with a traditional auction, the buyer has to make a commitment straight away. So what information do you need to provide as the seller in advance of the sale, and how long do you need to allow for that?
So yeah, in a traditional auction, you will be exchanging contracts straight away. So you need to have all the documentation ready, which in a normal sale, you wouldn't be looking to do until you'd received an acceptable offer on your property. So you need to make sure you've got a legal pack, which is available for prospective bidders to view before the auction. That includes things like title documents, land registry documents, local authority searches, leases, tenancy agreements if they're relevant, property information forms, fixtures and fittings, etc. And getting all of these together can take several weeks. You do need to make sure you act quickly on getting them all together ready for the auction. If you don't have a legal pack ready in time, then you will have to withdraw, and you will end up being charged with a withdrawal fee, which in some cases might be even as much as the commission you'd have had to have paid if you sold for your reserve price. So definitely worth getting organised and having that legal pack ready to hand. For a conditional auction, it's not a legal necessity to have the pack ready until you're exchanging contracts, but most auction houses will want you to have it in place before the sale, because apart from anything else, buyers are much less likely to make a bid if they don't have all those documents available to view and examine prior to making an offer.
Okay, thanks, Kirsty. And the final question I wanted to ask was, if you do choose to auction a property, how would you decide which type of auction house to use?
Yes, it really depends on the type of property. The traditional auction route is more suited to the investment property that needs a lot of work, or development plots. If you think the property is likely to appeal to a bigger developer rather than purely local interest, then it could be wise to approach one of the big London auction houses, because they'll have a larger pool of buyers who may not be particularly set on where in the country they're buying. The modern method of auction is more similar to a conventional estate agent sale. So if you're still going to attract, local buyers who may be looking for a house to live in. So if the property's in relatively good condition and it's your own personal circumstance that's pushing you towards the auction, then choosing a modern method of auction in collaboration with a local agent might give you better results.
Thank you, Kirsty. I hope that everyone has found some useful advice from today's session. And perhaps you could just sum up with a quick recap of our advice.
Yeah, sure. So I think the most important thing when selling any property is to make sure you're marketing it in the right place. And that means, for instance, choosing the agents who are best at selling a particular type of property or selling property in a particular price range. And that's a big part of how MoveWise works. The same principle applies exactly to auctions. They're the best place to find a particular buyer, which is usually somebody who's cash ready and looking for an investment opportunity. So for the majority of properties that are in relatively good condition, you almost always would be better off listing with a local agent initially. And where there's a problem with the property, whether it's unmortgageable or it needs a huge amount of work, there's some kind of legal issue, then that's where you might want to consider an auction. In addition to this, the reason may be that the seller wants a quick sale or wants minimum hassle. But in all these cases, we'd still recommend talking to a local agent first, because they'll have the best idea of the level of interest a property is likely to get. And that's certainly something our property team can always help with. We can propose a marketing plan where we list with agents for a fixed time and then switch to auction if necessary, so that you get a better chance of getting your full price, but still within a restricted period of time.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. So we've come to the end of the session, and I'd like to just address a couple of questions that we had sent in following the first occasion we gave this webinar. The first one of those was, is it possible to sell a shared ownership property at auction?
Generally no, except in cases where a seller has increased their share of ownership up to 100% by staircasing, in which case they would then own the property outright anyway. Legally, a shared ownership lease is actually considered to be a tenancy rather than a leasehold. So until you staircase up to 100% ownership. So if you're only a part share, then there are restrictions on how that property can be sold. And the reason for that is to make sure that shared ownership properties are kept available for the types of buyers who need to purchase them.
Okay, thank you. And the second question that we had was, who prepares the marketing material if you're selling at auction?
That again depends on the type of auction. For a traditional unconditional auction, the auction house puts together a brochure of all the properties that are to be sold. And that will include photos, sometimes floor plans, but they tend to be fairly basic details in comparison to an estate agent's brochure. The modern method of auction, the auction house usually works with a local estate agent, so you tend to get the full marketing material and also a listing on the online portals. But of course, you'd be paying more for this type of sale.
Okay, thanks very much, Kirsty. And thank you for watching. If you would like to know more about auctions, there is a guide to property auctions in the resources section on our website at movewise.co.uk. And we will be running more of these webinars throughout the year, so do keep an eye out for the next one. We'll be advertising those on our social media channels, and you can also sign up to our newsletter through the website to stay in touch and find out what we've got planned. Until next time, thanks very much and goodbye.